Good to be back with you. We are, just to refresh everyone, we are a few weeks into a study on how we got the Bible. And our objectives with this study are to examine how our sacred texts were developed, who wrote them and when were they written, how were they passed down, who was it that preserved them, how were they collected, and why this collection of texts and not some others. And we're going to do, and I think we'll see today, do some very careful and close readings of some texts, and maybe see some things that perhaps we don't often think about when we read the texts. And what it is not my objective to do, as I've stated each lesson, is it's not my objective to deconstruct your faith. So, if something that I say causes you to question something, causes you to shake some foundation of your faith, please come talk to me, email me, call me. My information is on the my Greenville Oaks site. If that's what happens, that's not my objective. And it's also not my objective to deny the Spirit's role in the development of Scripture. However, I think that the Spirit's role is actually much more profound than we give it credit for in the way we often think about how Scripture came about. So, where have we been since it's been a few weeks? We started out by looking at what is the Bible and how many are there. And we talked about how the Bible is a library of books. The word Bible means books. It doesn't mean book, singular. It contains a variety of diverse types of literature. The Bible was written by many different authors over many centuries. And that Jews and Christians disagree on what constitutes the Bible. And not only that, Christians disagree on what constitutes the Bible. The Catholic and Orthodox branches of Christianity have a different set of texts than the Protestant version, the Protestant branch of Christianity. And we've looked at how those books are variously organized. This is how the Protestant Bible is organized, and generally follows the order of the Catholic Bible, except for the insertion of some books between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we saw how Jews and Christians organized the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible differently, and that the organization of the Bible influences how we interpret the whole collection. So, for example, our Old Testament in our Christian Bibles ends with the book of Malachi, and the last verses of Malachi say, "And lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah, will turn the hearts of the children to their parents, and the hearts of the parents to their children." End of season 1, there's going to be season 2, right? And you flip the page, and there's season 2, okay? However, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, ends with 2 Chronicles. The command to go up, return to Israel, return to Jerusalem, which gives the whole collection a different bent than the way we read it as Christians. And so, effectively, the organization, or how we organize these books, influences how we read individual books within this library. And we also looked at that with how our New Testament is organized. It is not organized chronologically in terms of when books were written. It follows a specific order or pattern. And that influences how we read and interpret. These books were organized after the fact. Somebody did it at a later date. Their organization was not haphazard, but it had a design in mind. And when we read in different orders, we get different insights. So, now that we kind of covered that basic ground, what we're going to do for the rest of this study is kind of take different chunks of the Bible, starting with the Old Testament, and then moving through to the New Testament, and looking at who wrote them, and when were they written, and what might that say about these collections. And so today we're going to start with the first 5 books. We're going to start with the Torah. And as I was putting this together, I realized, oh my goodness, there's so much stuff we have to cover, it's going to take me 2 classes. So, this is part 1. So we're talking about those first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we first probably need to ask ourselves, what does the word Torah mean? When we talk about the Torah, what do we mean by it? The law, okay? That's how we often translate it. Is that the only definition? Is that the right definition? What does law imply? If we say it's the law, what do we imply?
Instructions.
Okay, instructions. What kind of instructions?
Defining or imperative.
Okay, imperatives mean commands. Okay.
Rules and regulations.
Rules, regulations.
Government.
Oh, okay, so we're circling around, like, is it a legal code? Is that kind of what we think of it as when we say the law? Is that how we use it in our modern context today? If we talk about, attorneys will often say, I love the law, right? I have a great respect for the law. We talk about law and order. And we're talking about what? The legal codes, the moral code, whatever that may be. Okay. Turns out that that's not exactly what the word Torah means. It really means instruction or teaching. Guidance might be another word. Direction. There's debate as to what is the, in scholarship we say, what is the etymology of the word Torah? Where does it come from? How does it derive its meaning? And there's a couple of possibilities, but one of them is the word yara in Hebrew, which kind of means to point, like to point to a direction. Okay? And so it's this idea that it's the direction you're supposed to go. It's to guide you in instruction. If, for example, if I were to if someone were to ask me how to get to my house from here, I might say, well, okay, you go out here to Greenville Avenue, and you can turn left, you can turn right, doesn't matter, but whatever, you then head, you turn left, and you go down, you turn right on Bethany, and you go down to Alma and turn right again. I can give direction, okay? Yara. Torah has that sense. It can also mean rule. And we see it used those ways in the Hebrew Bible. It kind of gets all distilled down to the word law when we get to Greek. And in Greek we have the word nomos, N-O-M-O-S. And nomos is it has more the legal sense. But unfortunately that's how it gets translated in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and it's what gets used in the New Testament, and it's particularly frustrating when you get to Paul because he uses about 500 different ways, and you're never quite sure which one he's talking about, because he's got one word he's dealing with. So, the Torah, we also call it the Pentateuch. That's the Greek from the Greek, which Penta means 5. There's generally agreement on its content and its makeup. People don't generally disagree on that. But it is not the legal code of ancient Israel. Okay? It does not tell them all the rules and regulations of how you organize your society, how much you tax people, how much you don't tax people. It covers some things like that, but it is much broader in its concept. It is much more seen as instruction or teaching, the direction that you should go, and it is meant to be adaptable. Even within the Torah, we have adaptation. After Moses gives all the commandments, we have this curious incident of the daughters of Zelophehad who come to Moses and say, okay, you've already talked about how the inheritance gets split and how the land gets divided up between the sons. Like, we're the daughters. Our father had no sons. What about us, Moses? And Moses is like, Oh, that's a good point. Hold on a minute. He marches over to the tent of meeting and says, God, you forgot one. Okay? And God says, oh, that's a good point. And he tells him, gives him instructions on what's to happen with daughters when there are no sons. Okay? Even within the Torah, it's adaptable. All right? But it also is not just this set of rules, because we see some rules in it in certain places, but it also has a lot of narrative. So it tells those rules in the content or the concept of a story. And that story is really the origin story of the people of Israel. Okay? That's kind of its general sort of setup. And it contains a whole variety of literary types. It's got narrative, it's got myths, it's got poetry, it's got conquest texts, it's got laws and regulations, it's got all sorts of things all mixed up together. So according to tradition, who wrote the Torah? Okay, Moses. Moses wrote it. And the question I want to explore today is, does that tradition hold up? If we look carefully and closely reading the text.
He definitely had to write about after his death.
We're going to get to some of that in just a second. So, where do we have references to Mosaic authorship? Well, in the Old Testament, in the books of Joshua and Kings, it talks about the Torah of Moses, or the book of the Torah of Moses. And we'll talk more about some of those in a minute. In Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, and Daniel, we see references to the scroll of the Torah of Moses. And the various prophets, they reference at different places and different times the traditions in the Torah and events that take place in the Torah and Moses. Okay? Sometimes they deal with them very differently. We may look at some of those when we get to looking at the prophets later on. And in the New Testament, we have about 80 references to Moses in various ways. Here's one from Mark where it says, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. It's in Mark 12. And it gives a specific quote that it attributes to Moses. And that quote is from Deuteronomy. We also see quotes in Matthew, we see references in Luke, we see references in Romans. There's a whole bunch of places where we see references to Moses and the Torah and the teaching or instruction given by Moses. We also see, outside of the Bible, what I'm going to call oblique references to Mosaic authorship. We have Philo of Alexandria, who dies around 50 AD. And he talks about the Genesis account of creation and says, as Moses wrote, and then he talks about some aspect of the Genesis account. We see something similar in Josephus, where he's talking about creation, and he says, as Moses wrote, and he gives us that. But neither of them really go into any specific detail about Moses wrote the whole Torah. They're simply saying, kind of as a matter of fact, as if everyone knows, as Moses wrote, and then they talk something about Genesis. Clement of Alexandria assigns authorship of the Torah to Moses. So those are kind of the references we have. But how does the textual evidence, when we read carefully and closely in the Torah, how does it hold up against that critique or that tradition? Well, here's one. This is from Deuteronomy. We'll look at a few from Deuteronomy, then we'll look at some other places. This is the very beginning of Deuteronomy. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, on the plain opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lebanon, Hazeroth, and Dizahav, by way of Mount Seir. It takes 11 days to reach Kadesh Barnea from Horeb. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord commanded him to speak This was after he had defeated King Sihon of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth and Edrei. Beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law as follows, and then the book goes on. What do you notice about this passage? Okay, it's third person. What else? Did I hear something else?
Moses didn't go beyond the Jordan.
Oh, okay. The phrase beyond the Jordan. Okay? Now, let's talk about directions. My water bottle is on my right. Is it on your right? It's on your left. Beyond the Jordan implies what? It means you're on the other side of the Jordan. Okay? I'm on this side, and beyond the Jordan is that side. Okay? Now here's the question. Did Moses ever get to this side of the Jordan?
No.
No. Moses dies on this side of the Jordan. So if Moses is going to talk about beyond the Jordan, what's beyond the Jordan for Moses?
Dead.
Canaan. Okay? It's the other side, right? Okay? Moses never makes it over here, yet the perspective of this passage of Deuteronomy 1 through 5 is it is being written on this side of the Jordan after the fact. And yet we know Moses dies and is buried, we'll see that in a minute, before they ever get over here. So there's a perspective of Deuteronomy that says it's happening over here. Okay? Hang on to that. This is at the end of Deuteronomy. This is chapter 31. Then Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Moses commanded them every 7th year in the scheduled year for mission during the festival of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing, assembled people, men, women, and children, as well as the aliens residing in your towns, so that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord and observe diligently all the words of this law, and that their children who have known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land that you are crossing over the Jordan to possess. Now, I want to look at that last sentence for a minute because it reinforces the earlier point. Where is Moses? On this side of the Jordan. I realize I'm doing this from my perspective, not yours, if that's north, south, east, west, and east. Moses over here, and he says, when you cross over the Jordan to possess, okay, so the speech is from a perspective that Moses is over here. But notice how at the beginning it says Moses did what? Wrote it down, okay, past tense, okay, and who he gave it to, right? And then it references this place that the Lord will choose, okay, sort of undefined at the moment. But it notes that it says Moses wrote this down, which means it's done from a perspective of
After he's already dead.
after he's already, it's looking back on it.
Yes.
Right? Looking back on it. Okay. This is a little bit later. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. We could have fun with that. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days when the period of his mourning was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Okay. Did Moses write this? Why not? He's dead. Okay. He's dead. Okay? Well, and then, we're going to get to another one in a minute. It's really fun. But at the end, it says, never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, who the Lord knew face to face. Well, let's assume Moses wrote that. Is that a very big claim? Well, it's a big claim, but what does ever since refer to?
Up until that point in time.
Well, it has to refer to the time before Moses. Okay? Okay? The fact that it says ever since, okay, seems to have some perspective that this is written well after Moses has died, and there have been plenty of other prophets that they can compare against Moses. Okay? If Moses is making the claim, okay, it's not a bad claim. Okay, we've got Noah, we've got, some would argue Adam is a prophet. We've got other prophets that clearly existed before then, but it's not nearly as bold of a claim as if this is written at some much later period when it's looking back at all the prophets that Israel had and comparing them against Moses and saying, ever since that time, there was nobody like Moses. It's like me saying, you know, there just hasn't been a president since Ronald Reagan that has done all the things Ronald Reagan has done. Okay, how many presidents is that? I'm guessing it's 5. But if I say, there has never been a president ever since George Washington, right, that did these things, and I'm saying that today, it means much more than if I say Ronald Reagan, or Jimmy Carter, or Joe Biden, right? You know, pick your president, right? It doesn't matter. It's the perspective of distance that makes it valid. Let's go back to Genesis. I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is about Abraham leaving and going with Lot and coming into the land of Canaan. And it says in the middle of that passage, highlighted in yellow, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. What does that statement imply?
They're not there now.
They're not there now. At the time this is written, there are no Canaanites in the land. Okay? Now, we can say it's this particular verse, right? That particular sentence, that phrase, had to be written at a time when there were no Canaanites in the land. Because the author has to make the point to say, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, let's say we attribute this to Moses. Were Canaanites in the land when Moses... yes, they were. Yes, they were. So, at least that sentence is not written at the time of Moses. It's written at a time later when apparently there are no Canaanites in the land. Again, let's see, this is just after Abraham is, it's in the process of the sacrifice of Isaac, and he gets stopped, and Abraham took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, this is the end, the Lord will provide. As it is said, to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Clearly written from a perspective of distance to say, we still say this phrase. And here's where it comes from. Okay? Now, when is that? We don't know. but it's written from a perspective of distance. Okay? Here's one I like. Because I love geography. I love how geography plays an important role in the text. This is from Deuteronomy 3. Moses, in his speech, is summarizing the path they've taken. And he says, "So at the time we took from the 2 kings of the Amorites the land beyond the Jordan, from the Wadi Arnon to Hermon. The Sidonians called Hermon Sirion. All the Amorites call it Sinir. All the towns of the tableland, the whole of Gilead, and all of Bashan, as far as Salekah and Adrei, towns of Og's kingdom in Bashan. Now only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. In fact, his bed, an iron bed, can still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites. By the common cubit, it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide." 2 things to note. You see on the map there, a lot of those names all show up on what side of the Jordan?
East.
The east side. And how does Moses, in this speech attributed to Moses, refer to them? Beyond the Jordan, meaning on the other side of the Jordan. Okay? So this speech is being written from the perspective of the west side, because all the places are on the east side. And it also refers to an iron bed, which can still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Now, again, it implies some distance from the event, because you can still go and see it. It's still there. And my favorite. Now, the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth.
He probably didn't write that, but himself.
Yeah, he probably didn't. Okay. If Moses wrote that, then Moses is not the most humble man that ever lived on the face of the earth. Okay? Clearly written at another time. So, what perspective is Torah written from? Someone said something earlier they noticed. It's pretty much written third person.
It's also written as history.
Okay, it's written as history.
And when we say Torah, we talk about there are 5 different things in that book. It's not one. It's a creation story. It's a law. It's a story of what's happening and whatever. It's not a cohesive one book.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I want you to hold some of that thought for my assignment for next week.
Okay.
Okay?
I'll
Because that's a very interesting question. Continuity. Okay? The narrator of the book, of the Torah, of the books, is what I would call selectively omniscient. Okay? At times, the narrator knows the thoughts of God. At times, the narrator communicates the thoughts and motivations of certain characters. At other times, they do not. Okay? At other times, you have to guess. Okay? But there are places in it where it will say something like, the Lord was very angry with Moses, right? Or the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Okay? Or the Lord was sad because of this. Okay? And there are other places where you have to read between the lines to try to figure out what the motivation was. But there is this sort of selective omniscience that factors into the story. And it seems to be written with some historical distance. Okay? That looks at events and reflects on them and assigns meaning to them based upon that distance and based upon things that perhaps have happened to the readers. Okay? Any questions about that? Does Anything bother anybody about that?
It feels more like parts of it were written in the past and other parts are written later on. As
Okay.
Of the
Okay. Good point.
text and manuscript that may have been written by Moses.
Good point. Very good point.
So if the writer was selectively omniscient, then there's certainty in that. So we're leaning on the side of fiction.
Are we leaning on the side of fiction?
Or is this what they mean when they say the Spirit of God was on X writer?
Okay, or was this the Spirit of God? Okay, yeah, so that's a good point. We're going to see, when we get to the books of Chronicles, what we're going to see is that Chronicles is looking at the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, and the exile into Babylon. It realizes that's not the end of the story. It's looking at it from the perspective of return. And so it interprets events differently. And it also whitewashes some stuff. First of all, it ignores the northern kingdom completely. The northern kingdom doesn't show up. All of the bad things David does conveniently get ignored. All the bad kings of Israel, well, Manasseh, yeah, he was a bad guy, but in the end he repented. So it puts a little bit of a, things aren't as hopeless as we thought they might be when you read the end of the book of Kings. Okay? So there's some of that. I don't go so far as to call it fiction, but there are clearly times when it takes a story and it adjusts perspective based on later events. As well, maybe that's not the best way to look at that now. Okay, it reinterprets.
I think it's a compilation of a lot of history and a lot of things that's been brought together. And I really don't think there's one author or whatever. I think it's many authors, and it's been brought together as a history or as a ruling. It's actually a history of the Jewish people early.
Yeah. It is. I mean, when teaching undergraduates, one of the professors that I work with, he uses a really good way to, when he's talking about, we're doing a class on Western religions, so it was Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he made a big point of saying that when we're talking about reading the texts that these religions consider their sacred texts, that what we talk about is their sacred story, right? The Jews have a sacred story. The Christians have a sacred story that includes the Jewish sacred story and adds to it. Okay? The Muslims have a sacred story that includes parts of the Jewish sacred story, parts of the Christian sacred story, and they add to it. Now, when you're teaching undergraduates, you have to say, because they're from all different backgrounds, like, we're not making truth claims about the individual sacred stories. We're accepting them as they are because we're not proselytizing in a class on Western religions, right? Where we are explaining how these religions take these sacred stories from themselves. In a church setting here, we are making truth claims, right, about a sacred story. Okay? It is a tenet of faith, right? And so for us, there is a truth claim to the sacred story. Now, that does not mean that every aspect of the sacred story has to be historically accurate fact, right? There is a truth claim in that what the story is telling and the message it is telling is important. And we're going to look at what is the message of the Torah, because it is clearly the origin story of Israel, how we came to be as a people and how we identify with the people around us and how God chose us for a specific purpose. That's the focus. Much like in the book of Acts. Okay, the book of Acts is not the history of the church. It says nothing about the church spreading to Persia. It says nothing about the church spreading to Alexandria and to Egypt. It says nothing about the church spreading a whole lot of places. It traces Paul and his spread of the church, right, for a very specific reason. So, and we see some of the same things with Torah. Big picture, down to Abraham, down to the people, into the land that God gives them. Okay? That's kind of the arc of how the narrative falls in the Torah. So, we mentioned that Joshua and Kings mention the law of Moses. Here's a passage from Joshua 8 where it says, and Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, and the Lord God, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, as it is written in the book of the law, an altar of unhewn stones on which no iron tool has been used. And they offered burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed offerings of well-being. And there, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. So my question is, what does this passage seem to refer to as the book of the law of Moses? Ah, okay, possibly the Ten Commandments.
Well, like, I mean, it seems like the modern Torah, or like the later version of Torah, was written as a revision of an earlier work, so this could be that earlier work actually written by Moses.
Okay, could be. It's clearly small enough that he can write it on the stones that he used to build this altar. So it gives a quote from this book of the law of Moses. Any idea where that quote comes from? The commandment about unhewn stones, altars are made of unhewn stones? Nope. It only shows up in Deuteronomy. Okay? So it seems to point to Deuteronomy as what it means by the book of the law of Moses.
One first passage says book of the law, then which it says copy of the law. Are they distinguished points?
Yeah, that's a good question. No. Now the question is, do you translate Torah in that second instance to be law, or is it teaching, or is it, what exactly is it? That could be a translation question in terms of how the word Torah, which has these various meanings, how it gets translated. Maybe it's kind of funny that the altar of unhewn stones, no iron tool has been used on it. What's the very next thing he's doing?
Yeah.
He's writing on the stone. So the question is, what is he writing on them with? Is he engraving it with an iron tool?
It could just be it has to be unhewn when you're doing the offering, but
Could be.
not afterwards.
Or is he writing, in some sort of ink or paint or something on it? That's indeterminate. That's in the white space between the black letters on the text. Okay, and here's one from 2 Kings. So, time of Hezekiah. Time of Josiah. Temple needs to have some refurbishments done to it, and Josiah tells his high priest, to the secretary, hey, go and make sure they get paid, the workers get paid for the work that they do, and trust them that they're not going to cheat us. And the high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan, who's the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. When Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. Then Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house being the temple, and have delivered it to the hand of the workers who have oversight of the house of the Lord. Shaphan the secretary informed the king, the priest Hilkiah has given me a book. Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and the king's servant Isaiah, saying, go inquire of the Lord for me, for the people and for all of Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. What book of the law does this refer to?
Probably the law of Moses, Torah of Moses, maybe.
General consensus is it's Deuteronomy. Now here's the question. What in the world were they doing before they found this book?
Anything they wanted to.
Probably the gradual decline.
Okay, there's another passage that reads a little bit further after this, where they realize, oh my goodness, we haven't been celebrating the Passover. And it says that they celebrated the Passover basically since for the first time in forever, right? Since they crossed over the Jordan almost. I mean, it gives a really long time since they celebrated the Passover. Okay, so it raises the question of what in the world were they doing in between?
Well, if you read the book of Judges, it talks about everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Aha! Judges says everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there's really no mention of the Torah in the book of Judges at all. Randy, question?
If you read First and Second Kings, they were doing everything but obeying the word of God.
Okay,
They were
yes.
following the detestable practices of those who lived beyond the Jordan,
Yes.
and they were doing it right in their own land.
Yes.
So,
Yes. But it's interesting that it seems like by the time of Josiah, they're not even aware that there was a law. Which begs the question of the Torah. And when is it compiled? When is it put together?
I wonder, though, if there was maybe an oral tradition, because Josiah and just a very few of the kings were said to have done what was right in the sight of God and followed the ways of David.
Yeah.
So they're following something even if they didn't have the written.
Yeah, yeah. And they have prophets that are telling them what to do, right? That are telling them. But it kind of brings up this question of, you know, if we just assume, well, they had Genesis through Deuteronomy, right, as we have it, then did they have it? Didn't they have it? And what were they doing in the meantime? And what did he find? And what was it? Now, Josiah institutes huge reforms across the kingdom, okay, to kind of set things right. Incidentally, if you read Chronicles, where King says Josiah is the first to celebrate the Passover and forever, Chronicles says it was Hezekiah. Okay? So there's a disagreement between Chronicles and Kings about who it is that really does the Passover celebration. But at least at this point, the question is, okay, at least as Kings tells us, there's some point in time where they don't even know about these books as we have them here. Okay? Again, I'm doing a close and careful reading of the text to look at what it tells us about the text that we have today. So, then we get the Talmud. This is from about 600. This is Jewish commentary on Jewish writings. And in this particular tractate called Bava Batra, there's 2 chapters in it, 2 sections of chapters that is discussing, in a larger sense, the Jews had believed that there was a copy of the Torah scroll in the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? Now, the Torah doesn't say that there was a full copy of the Torah scroll, but they believed there was. Well, then you get into this rabbinic debate, which is common, where they're saying, well, we know how big a Torah scroll is, and we know how big the Ark of the Covenant was. How in the world is that Torah scroll going to fit in the Ark? And so they're having this debate, okay, about, well, how big was it? How was it positioned? And then that leads to a debate about, well, who wrote what? And so you get this statement that says, Joshua wrote his book and 8 verses in the Torah. And so at least by 600 AD, you have rabbinic sages who are saying that these last verses in the book of Deuteronomy that talks about Moses dying and being buried, and ever since Moses, there hasn't been a prophet ever since, they claim Joshua wrote that, okay, that Moses didn't write it. But then they also say that Moses wrote his own book, Parashat Balaam, and Job. Okay? So the question here is, when it says Moses wrote his own book, what book are they talking about?
Probably Deuteronomy.
Well, Parashat Balaam is Numbers 22. Okay? So the way when the Jews are reading, they read through the Torah, on a one-year cycle. Okay? And every section is called Parashat. That's how you describe the section. And so you read through, and every week you read a Parashat. And so the Parashat is often defined by the first word of that section. Okay? And so Parashat Balaam is the story of Balaam, which is Numbers 22. So if they're distinguishing between Moses' own book and Numbers 22, what does that say about his own book? It doesn't include numbers.
Well, I do have to ask, and this may be a stupid question, but I don't, as far as I'm aware, Moses did not separate, or at this time they did not separate these books out. This was done at a later date. So
Correct.
Could it be possible that, well, part of Numbers, our version of Numbers, might be distinguished in this quote, that the other part of Numbers might have not even been related to this at that time?
It's possible. It's possible. But by this time, the book, the Hebrew scriptures as we know them, are pretty solid in the form that we have, right? And so the indication is that his own book does not equal the full Torah in this sense. Although, so you go to, there's a website called Sefaria that has a treasure trove of Jewish literature. And it gives all these books, you can read them, and it gives English translations. It says in its commentary that it means the Torah, okay? But when I went back and I actually read what it says in the Hebrew, it does not say Torah. It says his own book. And it's clear from the way it talks about Parashat Balaam that it's not the Torah. It's probably Deuteronomy. Probably Deuteronomy. So, what does all this mean? First of all, Genesis through Numbers makes no claim within the books themselves as to who wrote them. None of them say. Deuteronomy claims to contain Moses' speeches. Okay? It starts off at the beginning, says these are the speeches of Moses, and it attributes this book to Moses. We also see, though, that there are portions of the Torah, at least verses within the collection that we have, that are clearly not written by Moses, because they reflect later perspectives. And the references in Joshua and Kings seem to point to Deuteronomy, not Genesis through Deuteronomy. And the references that we see, although we didn't look at any today, in Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and Daniel, appear to reference Genesis through Deuteronomy, appear to reference the whole collection. Okay? So now we're going to look next week at some of the internal ideas. When people begin to ask, well, who wrote this? Where did this information come from? Okay? I want you to look at a couple things. First of all, I'd like you to take a look at, and this gets to the question that was asked earlier, read the last few verses of each book, and then the first few verses of the next book. Do they seem to continue one to the next, or is there a definite break? I think you'll see a mix. Also, take a look at Genesis 6:1 through 9:17. That's the flood story. And take a look at a smaller passage, Genesis 37:12 through 16. That's the story of Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery. And I'd like you to look for the following things. Look for repetitions and look for contradictions. Are people described by two different names? Do numbers coincide with each other? Does it say one thing in this verse and something totally different in another verse? Does it say one thing here and then all of a sudden it repeats it over here again? Look for those sorts of things in those two passages. In particular, pay careful attention to the numbers of animals in the ark. That's a fun one. And what are people called in Joseph, in the Joseph story? Who did he get sold to? Where are his brothers? Things like that. And we'll look at those next week and try to figure out some ideas of how people think this all came together. Thank you all very much for your questions, comments.